Welcome once more to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Today we are presenting an event in collaboration with Aleph Strategies, and this time I think it may be unique in the RSAA's recent history in focusing on music and its role in cross-cultural understanding. And we are exceptionally fortunate to have as our two main speakers, Eric Latzky and Matias Tarnopolsky, who have been important movers in this area for much of the last 2 decades. I will leave further introduction to Daniel Skillings. Daniel is the co-founder of Aleph Strategies, alongside Jonathan Ryder, who some of you will have seen at previous events. There will be an opportunity to put questions to our panel, so please post them using the Q&A button, not the chat button, please. And Daniel, Eric, and Matias will do their best to answer them. And without further delay, I will hand over to Daniel. Daniel.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Culture, including the creative industries and artistic expression, has the unique power to bring communities together that may otherwise remain apart. Culture can create space for dialogue and can be a starting point for broader peace and stability aims. Music has been central to this story. In 2008, the New York Philharmonic made a historic visit to Pyongyang in North Korea. For more than 20 years, the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, consisting of young Israeli, Palestinian, and other Arab musicians, has not only been a significant presence in the international music world, but has also had an aim to promote peaceful coexistence and intercultural dialogue. I'm honored to introduce our guest speakers today, who can speak to the very heart of this matter. As Michael mentioned, we have Mr. Eric Latzky and Mr. Matias Tarnopolsky. Eric is a communication strategist in the world of arts and ideas, cultural diplomacy, media, and cultural corporate sponsorship. From 2000 to 2012, he was head of communications of the New York Philharmonic, where he oversaw that historic visit to Pyongyang. In 2013, he founded the Eric Latzky Culture Communications New York Consultancy to create strategies for an international clientele. In 2018, he led communications for the West Eastern Divan Orchestra as part of their tour in the United States. For his part, Matias is president and CEO of the Philadelphia Orchestra and Kimmel Center. He has also served in key leadership roles at the New York Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and the BBC Symphony Orchestra. Among many of his accolades, he was awarded the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres by the Ministry of Culture in 2015 in France for a significant contribution to the arts. Gentlemen, without further ado, I pass the microphone to you, and I welcome you to this series. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Greetings from New York to everyone participating today, and thank you for joining us. I think we're meeting across several time zones. I'd like to say a special thank you before we begin to Michael Ryder of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, and to Daniel Skilling and Jonathan Ryder of Aleph Strategies for putting this together and putting the series together. And a very warm, heartfelt thank you to Matias Tarnopolsky for joining us today from Philadelphia, for being part of this conversation. Matias and I shared in building the two journeys we're going to talk about today, and there is no better person, more knowledgeable person to engage in this discussion with. So I'm very happy to have you here today, Matias. Thank you.
Great pleasure to be here, Eric. Thank you.
I'll say just a few words about the idea of cultural diplomacy. Cultural diplomacy is to a great extent a post-war idea, formed in the mid-century and codified over the past 50 to 60 years. Each pronounced project has been an experiment, really, and each has had unique contexts and attributes. Leonard Bernstein taking the New York Philharmonic to the USSR in 1959 in the nascent days of relations between the two nations. Eugene Ormandy taking the Philadelphia Orchestra to China in 1973 was another important historic example of cultural diplomacy. Each, in retrospect, have been credited with opening doors in early days of dialogues between nations. And I think we'll come back to the general subject of cultural diplomacy a little bit later on. A number of other vanguard or improbable journeys have taken place in the decades since. And now, perhaps the idea of cultural diplomacy can be somewhat objectified. We place expectations on the idea, but I want to ask the question, can it withstand the burden of that? Music is a powerful art form, and perhaps especially because it can speak eloquently, often without the specificity of words or other attributes that other art forms can bring. Matias, you've spoken often about the democratizing effect of the concert hall. What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, thank you, Eric, and thank you for that important introduction. And thank you for including me here today. And thank you very much to our hosts at the Royal Society for Asian Affairs and Aleph Strategies. What do I mean by the democratizing effect of the concert hall? I mean, music matters. You just said a version of music can give voice to words, to ideas that words alone cannot. The arts have often been silenced in totalitarian regimes. Look at Zhanov, Stalin, Shostakovich, Prokofiev. So music matters. When we're in a concert hall or chamber music hall, watching a group of musicians perform together, or watching a solo artist at the keyboard, whatever it is, we are at one with the music. And that's a great cliche. But what does that mean? Everyone is equal in front of the music. And so it is a very equalizing force. We all receive it in our own way, but there's no hierarchy there in the concert hall, sharing that musical experience. And so that's what I mean, that it can have a completely equalizing effect. Everybody has, if you like, equal voice in receiving and connecting with the art form. It's a truly democratizing force as an audience member or as a practitioner.
I think that is a great preamble to the New York Philharmonic's improbable journey to North Korea.
Yes.
So let's turn to that.
Most definitely.
It was the summer of 2007. I was the head of communications for the New York Philharmonic. Matias was the head of artistic planning. An unexpected and very mysterious invitation, a fax from the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, came in to this internationally known, this high-profile organization. And I'd like to set the stage a little bit, the context. As the six-party talks led by Ambassador Christopher Hill were beginning to show signs of progress, a thought, a strategy, what might culture do to advance the progress? The New York Philharmonic had met Ambassador Hill on a visit to Seoul a few years earlier when he was US ambassador to South Korea. South Korea was a frequent destination for the orchestra. We'll come back to background, but let's get a taste of the dramatic nature of what would become an event that made headlines around the world. This short video clip we're about to play is from the documentary Americans in Pyongyang, produced by EuroArts Music International, who joined us on the journey to document and capture the concert. The documentary itself is directed by Ayelet Heller. In the clip, you'll see Zaron Mehta, the president of the New York Philharmonic at the time, Paul Gunther, the chairman, and the late Lauren Mazel, music director of the New York Philharmonic. Michael, if you would, please play this clip.
The next composition that we will perform for you was written by America's most well-known composer, George Gershwin.
다음으로 연주하게 될 작품은 미국에서 가장 유명한 작곡가로 널리 알려진 조지 거슈인이 80여 년 전에 창작한 것입니다.
It is entitled An American in Paris.
제목은 파리의 미국인입니다.
Someday, a composer may write a work entitled Americans in Pyongyang.
앞으로 언젠가는 평양의 미국인이라는 곡도 나올지 모릅니다.
Little did I know that the remark I made introducing the American in Paris would appear on the front page of over 100 newspapers. Americans in Pyongyang. I couldn't possibly know that.
"280 people arrived by a 747, and I don't know if a 747 has ever landed at that airport. They had to bring special ladders and stairs, for deplaning, etc. And we went really off the plane, theoretically, into buses to take us to the hotels, which to enter a country like North Korea on that basis is absolutely remarkable."
It's just a little taste of the drama that was involved in setting up the trip and the arrival, which, as Zaron stated, was quite extraordinary. But going back to planning this event, with such a mysterious invitation, how do you begin? That was the question we had to ask ourselves. And the first step that we knew intuitively was authenticate. This was the kind of invitation we certainly hadn't seen before. I'm not sure anybody had seen before. And we turned to the US State Department. Our extraordinary guide was a woman named Yuri Kim on the Korea desk. Yuri is now the US ambassador to Albania. She became very much our guide all the way through this journey. We needed to establish a process. There was no roadmap for this. And that I really believe is true for each of the acts of cultural diplomacy, the two I mentioned earlier, but all major acts of cultural diplomacy. Each one is its own invention. With Zarin Mehta, who understood an intuitive sense of diplomacy, we established the first steps, and they were very important. They informed us all the way through. First, that it was an invitation, and an invitation must be answered. And more importantly, going forward, we decided early on that we would continue to move forward with the project until we determined that we couldn't move forward. So we were waiting for some event or occurrence that told us we could not do this. That never happened, and the project went all the way, so to speak. Matias, what was your initial reaction in the invitation? Was there value in pursuing this in your mind? Was there risk? Did the value potentially outweigh the risk?
My initial reaction was that this wasn't real. This was a joke. And and I think you similarly, and Zarin also, I remember just sort of holding this fax and just thought it was honestly funny. But it was a formally worded invitation coming from I think the representative to North Korea of the United Nations, and they sent it a couple of times. I mean, once on a Wednesday, another time on a Friday. It was something like this. And so the second time it came through, we thought, well, let's find out a bit more. And so once that initial decision was taken, and as you just said, we decided to proceed until we knew we couldn't. The train was set in motion, but the questions there from, we'll put aside the practical elements of mobilizing a whole orchestra, cargo instruments, etc., let alone the whole press operation, which was another parallel revolutionary aspect of this that you organized yourself, Eric. We first of all asked ourselves, does this have artistic merit? What can the impact of the New York Philharmonic, already an iconic American institution, already going on tour in the region, what impact can we have beyond the concert hall? And honestly, the answer to our question was, at that stage, we didn't know, but we did know that music is always a force for good. And with that in mind, and with the idea of not just performing, but on being in a community. So interacting with students, with other musicians, sort of helping in some way. We knew that we would be a force for good. If there's a moment that listening to a great orchestra perform great music, if we can bring that moment of transformation, that moment of reflection, change the way a group of people engage with the world through our presence, through the performance of the musicians. Even, the great Lauren Marzell, music director there, joking to an audience that I think by that stage had been sort of largely stoical, right? Humanizing a group of not just American people, but I mean, it's an international, truly international orchestra. We thought there's value here, and we have a responsibility to pursue it, and as much as we can do, use music as a force for good. And that was the decision.
Yeah, it was indeed a stoic audience on both sides, the American contingent and the North Korean contingent in the beginning, and the transformation that happened in the concert hall was something I know I'll never forget.
Unbelievable, unbelievable. The reaction at the end, I think it's captured in that film. It's quite something.
It is, and I believe Michael will post the link to the whole documentary if people wish to watch it. But to get to that point, a number of key decisions had to be made. First and foremost, the New York Philharmonic, a musical organization, one of the oldest organizations in the United States, would not act as independent diplomats. We would go to North Korea only if the United States government wanted us to. And we needed their guidance and support to build this project. We worked very closely as well with the musicians of the orchestra at every phase, and this was crucial. Their assent was imperative. One extraordinary day in the process in the fall of 2007, Ambassador Hill came to New York, met the orchestra over a pizza lunch in between rehearsals, and answered every single question members of the orchestra had. And I will just say, the New York Philharmonic, I've always felt is one of the most democratic bodies. They feel entitled to speak their minds, and they did. There were a lot of concerns, very understandably so, and Ambassador Hill answered them, and that led us to the next step. We began advanced negotiations. We established, and this was something that Zarin felt was important at the onset of building the project, we established a list of non-negotiables. And they included, with many Korean and Korean American members of the orchestra, all must be welcome in North Korea, or none of us would go. And keep in mind that the family histories of some of these members go back to the North. They predate the war. We would bring a list of non-negotiables. We would bring an international press corps. They must be welcome. And in the end, the International Press Corps was the largest, second only to Madeleine Albright's visit, we believe. There must be live, non-delayed satellite communications. And ultimately, 2 satellites were live for the full 46 hours. The traveling party, the orchestra, and the rest were on the ground. So live broadcast internationally, Wi-Fi and international telephone were established and existed for the full 46 hours. You have to understand that the Media Corps was filing stories in every time zone of the world around the clock. The press room, so to speak, with all of these technical tools was open around the clock, the full 46 hours. The broadcast of the concert internally in North Korea and internationally was crucial to us. And the flags of both nations should fly on the stage, flanking the stage, and they did, in fact. But crucially, because this is about music, we would choose the repertoire without consultation. Matias, why was the choice of music so important in the list of non-negotiables and in the project itself?
Well, if we begin with the idea that, you know, music gives voice to thoughts and ideas that words alone cannot, the choice of music is also absolutely critical. And we had extensive discussions with the then music director, Lauren Mazel, about what is going to make a tremendous concert, what is going to show the majesty of this great orchestra, what is going to show some of the musical history of the United States of America and of the orchestra, and what's going to represent sort of the then world of classical music. And I say then because 2008 seems not very long ago in some ways, but at the same time, the world of music has changed dramatically since we were in Pyongyang, Eric. And I think if we were doing the trip today, we may well have made some very different choices. But the concert there, every piece is a masterpiece, first of all. And you know, I'll focus on 2. The Gershwin's American in Paris and Dvorak's New World Symphony, Symphony Number 9 from the New World. First of all, two well-known masterpieces, but also sending a message about, if you like, the impact of America in the history of music. So here we have Gershwin, as Lauren Mazel said, then the greatest American composer, and one of his iconic pieces of music. Dvorak, of course, the great Czech composer, but inspired by a visit to America, no less, to write this piece, and to a visit to Spillville, Iowa, right? So not just to a major city, but to the middle, truly the middle of the country, and icons in the world of music. And of course, they performed it in a way that you probably haven't heard these pieces performed before, and as well pieces with which the New York Philharmonic has a defining history. And I think that was the main thing. Look what this ensemble, dating back to, what is it, 1842, and active and well today, look at what we're still doing today, and of course the New York Philharmonic still doing now.
There were two encores. One was Leonard Bernstein's Candide Overture. Of course, Leonard Bernstein is indelibly linked to the New York Philharmonic, and that was a celebratory, wonderful piece of music to play as an encore. But the final piece of music on the program played was a Korean folk song called Arirang. And I say Korean because this is a piece of music known to every Korean. It transcends political borders. Can you just say a few words about the choice to do that? Yes. And the effect that it had?
Absolutely, and I should say there's a lot more to be said about American in Paris and the Dvorak's New World Symphony. Excuse me, sorry. About Dvorak's New World Symphony. So there's also something else. We started the concert with the two national anthems, right? And they both start with a drum roll. So there was this incredible, or just a snare drum roll, and there was this sort of incredible moment when you didn't quite know which national anthem was going to go first. I remember feeling. But of course, ending with Bernstein's Candide Overture, and the whole premise of this, the first encore with Candide was, everything will be okay. The whole story of Candide is that everything is just this eternal sort of altruistic optimism is captured in this relatively brief piece of music. It is another iconic New York Philharmonic piece of music. On the day of Bernstein's death, there was a tradition, I don't know if it's still going, that the New York Philharmonic would perform this piece without a conductor. So it's a very sort of moving thing. But the message there is everything's going to be okay. And it's exuberant and beautiful. The audience really relaxed after that. And then, of course, it was so unexpected. Mazel and the musicians of the orchestra started playing Arirang, where, over a bed of strings, this gorgeous flute solo plays this melody that every Korean has in their DNA. And you looked out over the audience and people were in tears like I've never seen before. It was this moment of catharsis and profound emotion, that just made everything come together. The sort of formality of the concert then finishes when you've got the encore and sort of everyone can let loose. And it was a very sort of straight audience. I remember one of the other non-negotiables, Eric, was who's in the audience. And we wanted to make sure that there would be students and it wasn't just sort of government functionaries, but that like people who loved music would be there. And there they were. I mean, looking out over that audience, watching people in tears at this performance of Arirang is one of the most indelible moments of the journey. That's what music can do, right? So.
Thank you. With our South Korean partners on the project, the Kumho Group, which in part is Asiana Airlines, and MBC, the South Korean television network, we flew to Seoul. We left Pyongyang. We flew to Seoul to give a companion concert. And I think it was at that point, really, that assessment and history just began to be written about this. And I think in many ways, it's still being assessed what the value of this was. Did it have value? But I'd like to leave this section on the North Korea project with one short clip. It was a statement that Zaran made shortly after we returned to New York.
I've been convinced that if we go there and there is a chance that this will start to open up people's minds, if not in the next week, in the next year, then we will have done some good in the world.
What more can you really ask than to have done some good in the world? And I want to credit music for that, and the hard work of many, many, many people who made this trip happen. Let's turn to the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, and in particular their 2018 US tour. The West Eastern Divan Orchestra is a unique musical body. It was created by the Argentinian-Israeli conductor and pianist Daniel Barenboim, great musician, and the late Palestinian-American literary scholar Edward Said. Edward Said was Daniel Barenboim's sort of intellectual sparring partner, affiliated with Columbia University in New York. The Divan was an experiment at a 1999 workshop in Weimar, in Germany, using the structure of the classical music orchestra to promote coexistence and intercultural exchange. The orchestra was formed of Israeli, Palestinian, and other Arab musicians. The name is from Goethe's collection of poetry, The West Eastern Divan, a central work for the development of the concept of world culture. The 2018 US tour of the Divan to the most important concert halls in America, Chicago, Washington, DC, New York, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area, was set in the context of growing discord in our country, in the Middle East, around the world. In New York, during the tour, Daniel Barenboim was interviewed for the public television show Articulate, and he speaks about the philosophy of the Divan, but about more than that.
Hardly anybody remained with his original opinions or feelings or fears.
Daniel Barenboim believes that addressing such prejudices in the Middle East will be key to making real change, and he's advocated tirelessly for the idea that understanding is the most fundamental tool for peace.
We have two people who are deeply convinced they have the right to exist on the same little piece of land, preferably without the other. And they don't want to accept that this is not possible and that their destinies are inextricably linked. The destiny of Israel is inextricably linked to the Palestinians and vice versa. And you cannot solve this politically and you cannot solve this militarily. You can only solve this by bringing people to understand. And there's no use speaking about one-state solution or two-state solution. These are the solutions that have to come after the two people have understood that they have to accept the existence of the other in the region.
The West Eastern Divan Orchestra, which is based in Spain, has gained great renown and has performed throughout Europe, Asia, and the Americas, but they're rarely invited to play in the musicians' home countries.
We have many, many fervent admirers in Israel and many fervent admirers in the Arab world, and many negative critical views both in Israel and in the Arab world, which makes me feel that something that we do must be right. I would be very worried if it was positive on one side and negative on the other. But since it is both on both, and we keep going, you know. In those things, I'm very stubborn.
Cooperation is essential in music. One of the last events in the North Korea journey was a chamber music event, the Mendelssohn Octet, 8 musicians, 4 musicians from the New York Philharmonic and 4 North Korean musicians. It was in a small concert hall. And the idea of it was to show that if musicians are not cooperating, it shows. You hear it in the music. Matias, the Divan is that scaled up. It's all about cooperation within the structure of a classical music orchestra. How does that work? How does Daniel get a whole orchestra of people who may passionately disagree with each other in life to cooperate with each other?
Well, it all begins and ends with the music. Daniel Barenboim is a truly incomparable artist and humanist. And he created the West Eastern Divan, as you said, in collaboration with his dear friend and Edward Said. And the first gathering was in 1999. But he talked about, he uses many metaphors. One of them is sort of breathing with the same lung, speaking the same language, connecting sort of heart and stomach. I mean, just the sort of the hunger to make music with the soul that it takes to make music. He gathered these young musicians together and put countries that were officially at war, Israel and Syria, on sharing a music stand in the violins or cellos or violas, and began with music, right? So the opening chords of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, which was one of the pieces they regularly performed, you have to breathe together, you have to play together, you have to use the same intensity of weight from the bow to the string of your instrument, the same vibrato. You have to have the same intentionality or it doesn't work. And he conveys that sometimes with his words, mainly by his actions as a conductor, by his teaching of the music to these young musicians. And what does that do when you've worked with this level of intensity on, say, the first 3 bars of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, which contain a whole world, and you have someone like Barenboim not just explaining it to you, but in dialogue with you as a musician. And it doesn't matter how good a musician you might or might not be, he is able to find, the sort of kernel of beauty and truth and honest intention in every young musician. When you do that together for 3 hours, afterwards you can have a conversation. And the genius of the West Eastern Divan that Barenboim and Said had was, after a day of rehearsal of a level of intensity I'd never seen before, and I went to many of these gatherings, where you know, a whole world would be revealed through the first two chords of, say, the E-flat chords of the Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. There would be these intense conversations that Mr. Barenboim and Professor Said would moderate with the young musicians. And those conversations could only happen because of the music that had gone before. And because not just that they did it, but they did it with total focus, total concentration, and went into Beethoven with such depth that as you begin to emerge from the other side, it doesn't matter that you have a Syrian and an Israeli sitting at a music stand. They can begin to exchange thoughts and ideas and understanding and love. And that's what they do.
Yeah. Just before the tour began, or a couple of months before, Mark Swed, the great Los Angeles Times critic, who's followed Daniel Barenboim's work over many, many years, visited him in Berlin, where he lives, and interviewed him. And this was just one short quote, which I think reflects very much what you're saying. Daniel Barenboim said in the article, "Classical music is like a mountain. You can't see all the sides at one time. Sometimes something is very insignificant. Sometimes it's more important. Tomorrow, therefore, I know a little more." And I was so moved by this. I think it reflects the idea that it takes time and patience and the effort of all. So often we look for the panacea, the singular action to ameliorate all disparities between peoples, all political discord. But music is a quiet, gentler mechanism. You were directly involved in the presentation in Berkeley toward the end of the tour. How did the public experience it from your perspective? Did they perceive the idea of the Divan experiment, and did it seem meaningful to them in a world so fraught?
Yes, in short, absolutely. I don't agree with you, Eric, though, that music is a quiet, gentle mechanism. I actually think that music is probably the most profoundly important and visceral mechanism, because what I'd like actually to go back to those early years, and I'll talk about Berkeley in a second and other points on the tour, but you know, thinking back to the gatherings in Weimar, and let's remember where this is. This is in the shadow of Buchenwald, and the context for world history that these kids started gathering in with Said and Barenboim in 1999, etc., onwards, and parenthetically, they later moved to Seville, Spain, which is one of the few places in the world where Jews, Christians, and Muslims and Arabs rather had been able to coexist. So, you know, the symbolism of where they did their work has always been very important. But I remember these gatherings after a day of, you know, the first movement of the Eroica and these intense sort of activated talks, and it got so very heated, and both Said and Barenboim were trying to sort of mold the opinions and reactions of these kids. And he said, he stopped and he sat at the piano and he played a tango. So he went right back to his origins, and the music, not necessarily quiet and not necessarily gently, sort of diffused a very powerful moment and allowed more conversation to continue. And just scrolling forward almost 20 years to that moment in Berkeley, California, the University of California, Berkeley Cal performances, and to have many of these now a new generation of young students, but also some of the senior ones there playing it for this Northern California audience. It was, for us in the house, viscerally powerful. And it just connected those origins in 99 and 2000 and showed you just the power of music just to sort of cut through everything, because it speaks direct to the heart.
Thank you.
Respectful disagreement with my friend Eric.
I always defer to Matias on musical matters. There was one additional, there were several, but there was an additional article in the New York Times written by Michael Cooper at the onset of the tour, and he quoted Daniel Barenboim at the very first rehearsal, the first gathering of the Divan Orchestra, which was in Chicago. That's where the tour began. And he said, he told the orchestra from the podium before the music began, "I'm very, very happy to see you here." Mr. Barenboim said to the orchestra, whose members include Israelis, Palestinians, and musicians from other Arab countries, "I'm very glad that those of you that have strange passports managed to get into the United States." And it was tongue-in-cheek, of course, but he was reflecting the times. Even borders we might have thought to be relatively open were being tightened, as they sadly have continued to be to a great extent, and closed to many. The Divan cannot perform in Israel or Palestine at this point. For now, at least, the Barenboim Said Center for Music in Ramallah, Palestine, seeks to make music integral to the educational development and identity of children and young adults there. But the philosophy of the Divan lives, evolves, and grows at the Barenboim Said Academy in Berlin, which is a fully accredited music conservatory made up of mostly young musicians from the Middle East and North Africa. Students study music there, but they also study, to use a concise term, musical citizenship. As with the dynamic of the Divan, they learn to listen to each other. And the hope is that generations of musicians will bring this philosophy forward. Matias, I'd like to end the discussion of the Divan with one final question. Is music durable enough as a platform to carry a useful message like the philosophy of the Barenboim Said philosophy? Can this philosophy transcend generations of discord and help create a different future, particularly in the Israeli-Palestinian Arab context?
Well, the answer is a undeniable yes. I mean, invoking the many things that I learned from Mr. Barenboim over the years, it's the ear is the first sense to develop, even in the womb. It sort of connects physically to the body, but the act of music, singing, tapping on a desk as a percussion instrument, I mean, and then going on to actually learning a musical instrument, etc. But it teaches you some of the most fundamental sort of life civic skills, how to, the contrast, the difference between listening and hearing, the when to lead and when to follow, the importance of your own work in contribution to the work of the whole, to the ensemble. Really only music teaches that. And I could go on. I mean, there's much about this in the book that Barenboim and Said co-authored, Parallels and Paradoxes, a very interesting and important collection of essays. And so undeniably, yes. I mean, music is a truly equalizing, democratizing force, and the fact that it's the Barenboim Said, that the West Eastern Divan Orchestra has led now to the creation of a building, the Barenboim Said Academy and the Gehry designed Pierre Boulez Hall, you know, it's a place. It's not just an idea and a group of people. It's a place with faculty and students and a front door and civic public discourse. And what more powerful emblem than that? I mean, I'm, you know, continually admiring of what he and Professor Said and the whole team have done.
My visits to the Academy during the course of preparing the 2018 tour, there was one thing that I discovered that so impressed me. There's a small cafe in the lobby of the Academy, and we, of course, are all concerned with security these days. Sadly, the doors of the Barenboim Said Academy stay open all day long, and the public is welcome to stop in, have a coffee, have a bite to eat, to sit with the students of the Academy or others and to talk, and in a way that says it all about.
And you can hear music, and there's quotes on the wall by great artists and great thinkers. You know, this Goethe's idea of the West-East Divan made very, very, very real. It's a hugely important civic act.
A year or two after the North Korea concert, Zaran Mehta was asked by a journalist with some skepticism, so what did it all accomplish? And Zaran, with his signature understatement, thought for a moment and answered simply. He said, Leonard Bernstein took the New York Philharmonic to the Soviet Union in 1959. And he paused for a moment and he said, it would be another 30 years before the wall came down. And I've thought about that many times since. Perhaps this is a good place to leave and to turn to you, Daniel, to take questions. Matias, again, thank you so much for the conversation, and thanks to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs and Aleph Strategies.
Thank you, gentlemen, for giving us your reflections on these two improbable journeys and your broader sense of things in regards to cultural diplomacy. It was quite a fascinating discussion, and I thank you both for being with us. We just have a few minutes remaining, and I'll go directly to a few of the questions that have been posed. One is, should there be ethical borders set for music by politics? Would it be okay to play in Russia now at Putin's invitation?
Matias, would you like to?
It would absolutely not be okay to play in Russia now at Putin's invitation. That's clear as a bell. Would it be okay? So no, I mean, there's, you have to be very careful when acts like these, to not allow acts like these to get politicized. You know, I'm as head of the Philadelphia Orchestra now. Philadelphia Orchestra started going to China in 1973, the first American orchestra to do that. From day one, these trips are about people to people exchange. We need to connect with the people. So that has to be the very, very clear motivation. That's why among the non-negotiables was who's in the audience in North Korea. How are we going to engage with students? We want to bring music to the, I can't remember the name of the orchestra, the orchestra in Pyongyang, etc. So the musical institutions need to make sure they're connecting at a people to people level.
And in regards to that, with the North Korean, was there any follow-up? Was there a reciprocal North Korean tour of the United States? Did you get any feedback from the State Department in terms of next steps, or what impact beyond just the tour itself have you seen or heard?
There were discussions that continued for some time about a reciprocal visit, and we tried to continue that dialogue with the people we had met who could affect such a visit. The atmosphere changed, the context changed. So I won't say that visit didn't happen. I will say that visit has not happened yet. And I go back to Zarin's statement about the 30 years that ensued since the Philharmonic's visit to the Soviet Union in 1959. One can only put so much pressure on time, but as Matias says, to keep the ideal of music, of people to people dialogue, that leads to the next step.
Very fair. You mentioned Ambassador Christopher Hill a few times. It appears that individual champions were, in both cases, were necessary in order for these things to get off the ground. Has that always been the case? Was it also the case with China, etc.?
Absolutely. I mean, Ambassador Nicholas Platt, who is alive and well in New York, and maybe somebody who's familiar to the Royal Society. Ambassador Nicholas Platt in 1973 arranged the trip of the Philadelphia Orchestra to China and embarked on this sort of multi-generational connection now between the musicians of the orchestra and the people of China writ large. And these trips have been sort of totally inoculated from sort of, let's say, political appropriation because of that focus that Ambassador Platt brought to them. And he, his role was getting the orchestra there, convincing Eugene Ormandy, the great music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra then, on what repertoire to play. And that time it was Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, and it's probably a whole subject for another talk. And Nick Platt, Ambassador Platt's still involved in our visits to China and helping arrange and negotiate. It's never without complexity. So there's you do rely, like we did with North Korea, you do rely on very refined acts of diplomacy to help facilitate some of these conversations. But you have music going in the background and it makes everything much more possible.
And final question for you gentlemen, because I know Michael is saying we're out of time, is this regarding funding? Who is funding these endeavors, and how do we get more funding for these types of events to happen? Because they certainly create a lot of buzz and can have a lot of impact. Thank you.
Governments do support cultural diplomacy. The United States government, the State Department, has an office that focuses on it, and it has certainly supported the Philadelphia Orchestra. It has supported the New York Philharmonic. But I think probably more usefully, there are certain angels out there who appear. And in the case of the New York Philharmonic's visit to North Korea, it was an extraordinary woman, the late Countess Yoko Nage-Cheskina, who came forward to support this journey. Many other people supported it as well, but it was her leadership that got the funding going, and it was a very costly endeavor for a whole variety of reasons.
Thank you very much. Michael, I know you were telling us we're out of time, so back over to you. Thank you.
Well, look, thank you very much. Before I start to close, one of our viewers has asked whether the recordings of the concerts that have been discussed today are available online. I don't know the answer to that. Of course, part of the New York Philharmonic's trip to North Korea is available, and a link to the documentary about that trip is in the chat channel for anyone who wants it. But Eric, do you know, are the concerts themselves available as well?
That was the days of DVDs, a little bit more than streaming. The documentary was part of a 2 DVD set. One DVD was the documentary, the other was the full concert, and should be available from EuroArts International, EuroArts Music International. However, I believe they're both available online with just a little bit of search.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. And well, I mean, first of all, let me say a very warm thank you to Eric and Matias, first of all, for sparing so much time and for giving us such an outstanding insight into these two very different but very important cross-cultural initiatives. I mean, as we stand at the moment, I mean, somebody asked about Russia. As we stand at the moment, with Russian soldiers creating the most appalling havoc in Ukraine, it may be hard to imagine that initiatives of this kind might someday play a role in healing the wounds of this conflict, but we may hope that they will, even if it's some time coming. In 3 weeks' time, somewhat nearer, on the 27th of April, we will have a panel discussion on the role of the Chinese Communist Party's United Front. And on the 4th of May, we return to this series when we will have speakers from, among other places, the Overseas Development Institute, talking about the place of culture in engaging in dialogue with armed groups. And details of both of those events are available on our website. I hope that you will join us then. A recording of today's discussion will be available on the RSAA's website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And I will just close again by thanking Eric, Matias, and Daniel, as well as all of you in our audience. We have some music for you as we close. And until then, it is goodbye from us.